Hello and welcome. I thought I'd make this little video about the vocoder in Ableton Live 12. I think you can do this with many different types of vocoders, but specifically with the vocoder in Ableton Live. I was experimenting with using the vocoder in different ways instead of just having an input signal from a different channel and seeing what I could get out of it. I tend to sort of use the vocoder in a very traditional way, but I wanted to see what kind of different sounds I could get with it. And as you heard from the intro, I feel like I achieved something pretty cool. So let's have a look at how to do that. This is the finished sound of what I've got to. But let's build it up from scratch and see how we can get to that sound. I'm going to explain elements of the vocoder as we go through, but I'm not going to do an entire tutorial on how a vocoder specifically works, but mainly just how to get this sound. So starting from scratch, I've just loaded in a new instance of vocoder and turned the original one off that I was working on. The first thing that I was looking at was these different input modes. We've got noise, external, modulator and pitch tracking. I'm not going to go through these individually, but I just started with noise to see what would happen if I did that. The dry wet's set to 100%. Actually, let's listen to the signal before, and it's just a simple sawtooth and Vital. So when I turn the vocoder on, you can hear the rhythm of the original sound and a slight bit of musicality, but it's very much buried within that noise. So as I was playing around with this, I was thinking, where can I take this? It just sounds like noise at the moment. So first of all, I saw this sort of XY pad, and I haven't really played around with it that much, so I just decided to move the circle around. And I started to find some really interesting sounds as I was going through it. And when I moved it to this point here, I started to hear this sort of static effect, and I was thinking, oh, that sounds a little bit more like we could go into some kind of extra rhythmical kind of element. So the next thing I started to look at was, how can I make this more musical instead of just sounding like noise? So I started to look at all of the different parameters that we have in this window here. I changed the bands to 40, which basically segments all of the incoming signal into smaller bands across the entire range that we have here from 80 Hz to 12 kHz. I'm going to get into that a bit more as we go through this. And I found that brought back a little bit of the musicality straight away. Not a massive amount though, we still don't have that much musical nature to the sound, it's still quite noisy. But as you can hear, it's brought in a little bit more of that musicality back. So the next thing I thought I'd start messing around with is the range, just to see what would happen. So I brought the lower end all the way down to 20 Hz, which I usually do when I'm working with a vocoder. But this top range, I usually just by default increase it to its maximum. But let's play that back while I change this value to see what happens. I then started to find the lower I got, it was bringing in a little bit more of the musical undertone of the sound input that was coming from Vital. Now obviously the different types of sounds that you'll use, if you're doing this on a lead or a bass, you're going to use slightly different ranges. But I was starting to find just below 1 kHz, it was basically just leaving all of the musical elements. Obviously it's still very noisy, but mainly the musical elements of the original sound. So next thing I wanted to sort of have a look at was this bandwidth, which is basically two different types of filters. You've got precise and then you've got the retro kind of vocoder filter. And I just thought, well, what happens if we pull this number down from 100%? Now we're getting into a very, very musical area, but it's starting to ring out a little bit too much. And I found specifically for this sound, bring it to around 62%, was like the happy middle ground between the sort of noise carrier and the original sound that's going into it, the sawtooth from Vital. The next thing I wanted to play around with is we've got the gate and then the overall level. Now I did find that this made the sound quite quiet, what I've done here, so I thought, okay, let's bring the level up. Now we've got some loudness back in the sound, but I wasn't sure what this gate would do to the sound, so I started to just bring the value up from -infinity. And as you can hear, it sort of does what a gate does. If the sound is below the threshold value, it won't play back. And this allowed to sort of scatter the frequencies out into only the sort of loudest frequencies that are coming back in this spectrum here. But I did find that gate value that I've got to there was just a little bit too extreme on the sound. And I found a happy medium for what I was working with here, about -54 decibels. The button just above noise here for the carrier enhance. I decided to just press that to see what would happen. It just seemed to give a little bit more clarity to the sound overall. So I decided to keep that button pressed in. Next part over here we have sort of an envelope. I was never really sure what this dial here did, depth. But looking over at the tool window, it basically sort of is the depth of how these envelopes work, so the attack and release. If this is set all the way down to 0, nothing that we do to the attack or the release is going to change it. With it being set to 100%, sort of normal range. But in this instance I thought, what happens if I take the depth all the way to 200%? Now we're getting into that sort of sound that I've titled this video as, the musical raindrops of a vocoder. But just coming back to this, I found it was just a little bit too bold in sound, and not as raindroppy as I wanted it to be. But coming back to this bandwidth, changing the mode from precise to retro really did change the sound. I also had to play around with the formant value as well, which just shifts the formant filter up and down. But for what I was doing here, I just liked it in the middle. But using the different values, you've got 12, 24, I think the maximum is 36. And then changing the release as well. You can get into some really sort of top-end gritty sound. So if you can think of situations that you would find that useful, there's many different applications to what this vocoder type can do. Now with me setting the range to 1 kHz, I found playing very high notes on a MIDI keyboard didn't really come through very well. So if you want this for a sound that has got a lot of notes in higher octaves, you will have to increase the range. But for what I was doing here with these chords, it fit pretty well. And if we go between the dry and the wet signal, just to sort of hear the difference. It's quite a crazy difference what happens between the sound, but I thought it was really, really cool. Hence why I wanted to make a video on this sound, something that I'd never really heard a vocoder do before. So what I ended up doing, after I'd finished with the vocoder, I decided to bring in a multiband dynamics, which I'm not really going to explain. Why I did this was more to just sort of enhance the top end, the lows, and flatten out the mids a little bit in level wise. And this is what I ended up with. I also added a stereo delay as well, just to sort of let those raindrop frequencies in the top end sprinkle out a little bit more over time. But this multiband dynamics really accentuates the top end and really brings out that sort of musical raindrop sound that I was going for. So anyway, that's all I've got for this video. I just wanted to showcase this, what I think is a really, really cool way of using the vocoder. It's not really the sort of standard having a musical input that affects another sound, like if you were vocoding a voice from a synthesizer, but using a noise carrier to become quite rhythmical and, in what I'm hearing, quite raindroppy in sound. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks again for watching, and as always, until next time, God bless and goodbye.